Hello, I'm Dr. Jane McCartney. I'm a consultant chartered psychologist in the UK. I'm fascinated by human behaviour, but particularly crime. What leads a person to, or in this case, persons to commit such dreadful acts against another? I've worked for the NHS for many years and for the court system in the UK. Before I start, if I could please ask you to like, subscribe, share, the usual things, and please feel free to put comments below. It's always really fascinating to hear what people have to say about these crimes. In today's episode, which is a podcast episode, I'm going to look at the case of the murder of Rachel Hudson, who would be found in just the most awful circumstances, the emaciated situation that she was found in, and the subsequent trial and conviction of the people that turned out to kill her, her in-laws.
On a freezing cold morning in March 2003, the police were called to a body that had been found in the grounds of Newstead Abbey in Nottinghamshire, in the heart of the UK. To begin with, the police thought that they were dealing with the body of a small Chinese man, but on further examination, it was discovered that it was the body of a female in her early 20s, and she was almost covered entirely in recent and old injuries. It took 3 weeks to identify the victim. She was Rachel Hudson, 20, a mother of 2, and she had suffered more than 60 injuries, including broken bones, deep cuts to the soles of her feet, cigarette burns, scalding, skin loss. Her hair had been shaved close to her head, and she had a cut on her lip so severe that it had come away from her skull. 11 ribs were fractured, front and back, and her lungs had been punctured. Rachel, it would turn out, had died from a blood clot to the brain, septicemia, and severe dehydration. It wouldn't be until October 2005, over a year and 6 months after Rachel's body was initially found, that her murderers were eventually sent to jail. This is the story of 16-year-old Rachel Manga, who had the misfortune to marry into the notorious Hudson family of Nottingham. It's 2002, and Rachel Manga, at the age of 16, had recently had a baby. From what her family said, she was a bright girl. She'd gone to her local grammar school, which in the UK is what's known as a selective school. It's where the more able children, once they've been tested, could choose to go to. Rachel had done moderately well at school. She had good friends, but by 16, she'd become pregnant and had a baby. In October of 2002, with her young baby left at home, being looked after by her family, Rachel took a rare night out and went to the local fun fair. It was there, on one of the rides, that she would meet Craig Hudson. Rachel had just had a baby. She was lightly thinking, who, as a teenage mother, is going to pay her any interest? And Craig Hudson paid her interest. I'm not sure what happened after the initial meeting in October of 2002 and a few weeks later in November of 2002, but Craig and Rachel were married in the November of 2002, just a few weeks after they'd initially met. It would turn out that Rachel's family, her 2 younger sisters, her mum and her dad, who had been divorced when Rachel was younger, her grandparents, in fact, any of her family did not attend this wedding. They would say later that right from the beginning, the Hudson family were overbearing and they were demanding money towards the wedding of their son and Rachel. Initially, Rachel and her new husband would move in to an overcrowded council house with the Hudson family. The house was ruled with an iron rod by Ronald Sr. and his wife Trudy. He was known to be extremely abusive, very aggressive, and pathologically seeking control of his entire family and any extensions to that family that had the misfortune to come across the Hudsons. The Hudson family, who lived in a 3-bedroom local authority family house, consisted variously of Ronald Sr., Trudy, and their 12 children, some of whom would be living at home with their partners, and some of whom had left home. It was a crowded house that Rachel moved into. You can only imagine what Rachel would have thought of this new family of in-laws. She had come from a relatively quiet family home consisting of her mother and her 2 younger sisters. And there she was, with her new baby, thrown into the chaos of what would seem like dozens of people, shouting, screaming, arguing, fighting and swearing, with an aggressive, toxic undertone permeating the whole house 24 hours a day. Not long after Rachel and her new baby had moved in to the explosive atmosphere of her in-laws, Rachel and her new husband would leave. They would be found local authority-assisted accommodation. However, their newlyweds' hard-won freedom would not last long, because Craig's family, headed by Ronald Sr., the overbearing, aggressive control freak of a father, and his highly manipulative mother, Trudy, would, to start with, find out where they had gone and continually hassle Rachel and Craig to return to the family home. They would complain to the local council about the intimidation that they were receiving, and they were themselves rehoused. At one point, the senior Hudsons would report Rachel and Craig as missing persons to the police, and somehow they managed to get the address where Rachel, Craig, and Rachel's baby were living. And they would just continue the relentless drive to make Craig and Rachel return to the family home. They applied for social housing one more time in a neighbouring county in Lincolnshire, but they were turned down, and feeling that they had no option left to them, they returned to the Hudson family in Nottinghamshire. Having temporarily escaped the oppressive clutches of the Hudson family, Rachel had started work in a local nursing home, and it was reported that she enjoyed her job, she was cheerful, she was bubbly, she was everything perhaps a 16-year-old should be. It was then noted that she rapidly became withdrawn, she lost huge amounts of weight, and would soon leave the nursing home job that she enjoyed. This would be probably when she moved back in with the Hudsons. This is early 2003. Remember that Craig and Rachel had only got married a couple of months before. They tried escaping from the family, but had been sadly inevitably dragged back. At some point in 2003, Rachel has another child, this time with Craig. November 2003 was the last communication that Rachel would have with any of her family. She would send a text to her dad saying that she had no shoes, she was trapped, and if she was allowed to leave the house, it would be done with at least 2 minders from the family. At this point, Rachel has been suffering abuse, torment, physical violence, and intimidation from her in-laws in the place that she had dreaded going back to. It would come out in the trial that on their return to the Hudson family, Craig had been told he was no longer allowed to communicate with his wife. She was kept a virtual prisoner in this home, where she was regularly beaten, humiliated, and would have all of her possessions stolen from her. At some point, she was made to make a videotape confessing that she had become a prostitute, she had enjoyed prostitution, she was cruel to her children, and she was having multiple affairs with other men. This was done under duress in the perverse belief that once Rachel had left the home, alive or dead, the police would believe this so-called confession and cease looking for her. So back to the timeline. In January 2004, remember she's not long had her second baby, Rachel requested a visit from her local health visitor for what was put down as severe postnatal depression. It was noted that Ronald Sr. and Trudy, her father and mother-in-law, were aggressive towards the visitor, and any further visits were not followed up. This request turned out to be Rachel signing her own death warrant. Rachel's father, from time to time, would try and inquire about his daughter. He was told by the Hudsons that Rachel had gone missing. When he reported this to the police, they naturally went to the Hudsons, an address they were extremely familiar with, to inquire about Rachel's whereabouts. Again, they were told the same story, that she had gone off with another man. As to whether they were shown the tape of the so-called confession, I can't quite find out, but it was obviously something that they were keeping as their collateral against any inquiries about Rachel. A few weeks later, in February 2004, a call was noted between Trudy, the matriarch of the Hudsons, and Shane, one of her many children, at that moment serving time in a young offenders institute for a violent attack upon somebody else. Seemingly they were discussing the abuse that Rachel was enduring, and Shane was noted to say this could end up as a murder case. In early March 2004, Craig, Rachel's husband, who, remember, was not allowed to have any contact with Rachel when they returned to the family home. He was not allowed to talk to her. He was not allowed to even make eye contact with her. He would find her in the kitchen, bound and gagged, beaten, with cigarette burns all over her body. One of Craig's younger sisters, Charlene, would say later that she saw Rachel, wearing only her underwear, being dragged upstairs by the girlfriend of Shane Hudson, who, if you remember, was serving time at a young offenders institute when Rachel died. His girlfriend, Lizzie Hogg, was seen to drag Rachel upstairs by her hair and force her into a cold bath. Charlene would say Rachel began to make funny noises. Lizzie dragged her out of the water and onto the landing, and that's where she died. She was left at the top of the stairs for some hours, whilst Ronald Sr. would visit various sites with the intention of dumping Rachel's body. And so, a couple of days later, Rachel was found wrapped in a carpet at Newstead Abbey, the ancestral home of Lord Byron. As I mentioned earlier, it took a few weeks for Rachel to be identified properly. When the police eventually found out where she had come from, they met a wall of silence at the Hudson family. It took them over a year and a half to be able to build a case against the Hudson. And in October 2005, Ronald Hudson Sr., Trudy Hudson, Ronald Hudson Jr., Craig Hudson, Rachel's husband, Emil Hudson, Charlene Hudson, Shane Hudson, Lizzie Hogg, the girlfriend of Shane Hudson, and Andrew Hudson Makings, the husband of an unnamed Hudson daughter, would go on trial for the murder of Rachel Hudson. Prior to the murder trial, at directional hearings, the family loyalty that the Hudsons had worked so hard to maintain would instantly disappear, with each member blaming each other. At one point, a massive fight broke out between various members. Then Ronald Sr., who had blamed everybody but himself, sustained a broken wrist whilst fighting with his son Shane, who had recently been released from the Young Offenders Institute, where he himself was serving time for an assault. At countless times during the trial, when the focus was on Ronald Sr., one or more members would shout from the public gallery, "It's all lies, don't believe him." As his defence, Ronald Sr., he would blame his eponymous son Ronald Jr. for Rachel's death. He would say, "He split my marriage up 3 times. He's a real piece of crap." And Trudy would say that she believed her son, Ronald Jr., was responsible for delivering the fatal blow to Rachel, telling the court, "God help me, I gave birth to a monster." Tempting at this point to say, "Only one, Trudy." The trial ended just before Christmas of 2005. Ronald Hudson Sr., Trudy Hudson, Ronald Hudson Jr., Craig Hudson, Rachel's husband, and Lizzie Hogg were found guilty and convicted of the murder of Rachel Hudson. Ronald Sr. and Trudy received 20 years, Ronald Jr. 17 years, Craig and Lizzie Hogg 14 years. The other members of the family, Charlene, Shane, Emil, and Andrew Hudson Markings, the son-in-law, were convicted of perverting the course of justice and sentenced accordingly. At the trial, the pathologist who had done the autopsy on Rachel would state in the final 48 hours of life, Rachel had received 33 distinct injuries on top of many, many older wounds. She also had 27 injuries on top of older wounds in the 2 weeks before death. It was found that she had died from a seizure, from an untreated brain injury, and had likely died in the bath. He also said that he couldn't find a part of her body that wasn't injured, including large, deep lacerations to the soles of her feet. He also surmised that Rachel wouldn't have been able to walk or talk prior to her death. So, the question is, who the hell were the Hudsons, and what led them to torturing a young, innocent girl to death? We have to go back a generation or two to get an idea of where Ronald Sr. and Trudy had come from. The families of both Ronald and Trudy were well known to the social services, the councils, the education authorities and the police when they themselves were children. Both had come from neglect and abuse. When one local authority official had visited Trudy's family home when she was younger, her mother had been noted to be sitting in a filthy nightgown, eating cornflakes from a washing-up bowl. Trudy and Ronald Sr. had met when Trudy was visiting somebody at a local prison where Ronald himself was serving a sentence for aggression. They would meet and get together as soon as he was released and start their family. Remember, they had 12 children. In their married life, they would have 20 different properties. They would move for rent arrears, for antisocial behaviour. Former neighbours would say that living near the Hudsons was really living near the family from hell. At one point, one of the properties that they were asked to leave, it took thousands to clean up after them, and they would find upward of 60 dirty nappies just left in the living area. They were known to be very aggressive, unapproachable, and they knew how to handle the benefit system. They had lots of children who would equal lots of benefits. They didn't particularly care whether their children were engaged in the education system or not, and soon it would become known to the local council that dealing with the Hudsons was like knocking your head against a brick wall. So over the years, as much as their children weren't going to school, there was antisocial behaviour, there was criminality, there was huge amounts of aggression and toxicity. The agencies would be reluctant to take on the hassle of dealing with this family. As one family associate would put, if they didn't want you to come into the house and it wasn't beneficial to them, nobody would get into the house. And remember, Rachel, who had been reported missing by her own father, and the police had gone round to the last Hudson house, they weren't allowed in. They didn't want her to be seen. Quite what the situation was with the postnatal health visitor that Rachel had seemingly requested or had requested on her behalf a visit from, whether that health visitor was able to gain entry to Rachel and her baby in the Hudson house, I'm not too sure. But I largely would imagine that she wouldn't have been. And then this wasn't followed up. So Ronald Sr. and Trudy have got together, and from the beginning there is a highly abusive, aggressive and toxic relationship. He had convictions of GBH against Trudy. Seemingly over the years that they were together, she would try and leave, but he would kidnap the children until she returned. And eventually, like the agencies that have tried to intervene with the family, she just gave in, and eventually she just absorbed into the clan and the tribe violence that the Hudsons permeated throughout the generations. During the trial, it was said that Trudy would see any babies born into the family, such as Rachel's original baby and the baby that she had with Craig, as a meal ticket. She would control the family's finances and the benefits accordingly. And this is why it was so crucial that when Craig and Rachel had initially left after their wedding in 2002, to get them back, because children are money and money gives you power. So both Ronald Sr. and Trudy had come from dysfunction, aggression, toxicity, abuse. So it's little wonder that these two people would get together and then very, very quickly start having huge amounts of children themselves to perpetuate what has been ingrained in them from the beginning. And when you have somebody that has come along and they've tried to threaten that, and I'm going to get to the dynamics of the group, because this is what this was. This was a group turning on an outsider. It may have been a family, but it was still a group. Ronald Hudson would maintain the group through violence, through threats of violence, through aggression, because the group is everything. The group together is power. The group together is money. The group together is influence. The group must be maintained at all costs. And when poor little Rachel came along and tried to take just an ordinary member of the group away, that was the threat. And getting them back was the first thing that they had to do, which it seemingly didn't take that much effort. You know, they were told that they had continual hassle from the family when they moved out. And at some point, I largely suspect that Craig probably said, we're going to return there, so we might as well do it now, because they will not give up. The threat of the family group is the all-important thing to Ronald Sr. and Trudy to a large amount, but she's more motivated by the money. He is motivated by the power and the control of his family group. And when the threat has come, the threat had to be dealt with. And also, the threat to the group, the family group, who was Rachel, had to be made an example of. And what I find particularly interesting about this is that you have Rachel, who has married Craig, you have Lizzie Hogg, who is together with Shane, another one of the sons, and there seems to be, and she was convicted of Rachel's murder, and there seems to be the direct comparison between these two girls of a similar age. And it's almost as if Lizzie Hogg was ingratiating herself. She was passing the initiation ceremony of being so brutal to the person that had had the temerity to try and break up what they believed to be the tight family unit, whereas it was chaotic, it was dysfunctional, it was aggressive, it was everything that nobody would want, but they needed to maintain that because that's all Ronald Sr. and Trudy had known throughout their lives. So maintaining what they knew was the number one priority, and Rachel coming along as a perceived threat to that had to be dealt with. Add on to that somebody that wants to ingratiate themselves to become, in inverted commas, a real part of the family, to be accepted. And it was a sadly predictable end to what happened to Rachel. I've looked at research on group dynamics. I'm always really interested in it. And if you take any gang, any group, any more than a few people that have a common cause, what will happen is the group, in this case the family group, the Hudsons, and this has been borne out by all the social services interventions, all the reports from neighbours, they will take on and they will copy the morals and the actions of the worst member of the group, and often exceed it to show power. And in this case, they had Ronald Sr. I don't know if he has a diagnosis or whether he has been subsequently diagnosed, but he sounds like a psychopath. He has most of the things that you would expect a psychopath to have. He would have an inflated sense of his own self-worth. He would have no empathy, a lack of remorse, of guilt, shallow, if any, emotions, using others, blaming others, poor control over his behaviour, and a pathological liar, which in the court this was proved, and people would shout from the gallery, don't believe him, it's all just lies. And he would try and blame his younger son, his eponymously named son, on the murder. So when you've got that as the I'm loath to say it, but the head of the family, other group members, to try and initiate themselves, to try and gain power themselves, would be copying, would be led by his behaviour and potentially taking it up a notch or two. And when you've got the two outsiders, one of whom is desperate to belong to the family, Lizzie Hogg, Shane Hudson's girlfriend, one of whom is clearly the opposite of that and wants to distance herself from the family, Rachel herself, it is a toxic and dangerous mix with, in this case, a sad inevitability of the elimination of what they would have considered to be the weaker of the two. You don't come up to our standards, therefore you can be beaten, you can be starved. She was just 6 stone when she was found. You can be humiliated. Apparently there were times where she was thrown downstairs. She was constantly burnt with cigarettes, and she had her head shaved, which again speaks volumes. It's a bit like in France after the Second World War, that the women that they felt collaborated with the Nazis, they would shave their heads to shame them. So not only did everybody know that they had collaborated instantly, but taking away their crowning glory was a humiliation on top of that as well. So it marked them out who they were, but it was also to shame them. And the same thing with Rachel, they shaved her head. They would hit her. They talked about using her as a punch bag. She became unhuman to them. She was just an object to be toyed with. It's a bit like a gang of feral cats surrounding a mouse. At some point, this mouse is going to die, but in the meantime, they're all going to have their fun whilst they torment it. The family was so removed from the humanity of Rachel. At the trial, it would turn out that when she was being brutalised and beaten, she would be hit with a baseball bat that they called Mr. Woody and a piece of wood that they called Captain Plank. This was funny to the family. This was amusing to the family. This would be an older member of the family saying to a younger member, oh, go and get Mr. Woody because we're going to smash Rachel round the back of the legs now. And they would do that to become, because they wouldn't have known any different. This was what this family did. It was abusive, it was violent, it was vile, but this is what this family did. And take warning, because if you're not a member of us, then you're against us. And look at the example that we are putting in front of you of somebody that dared to be against us. All Rachel wanted to do was start her family with her new husband and her new baby. But to the Hudsons, that was like lighting a barrel of gunpowder. It was just explosive and it couldn't continue. And that's why they went on the campaign to make sure that they came back. Because 1, they had to get Craig back. 2, they had to get the children back for money. And 3, and probably most important to them, they had to make an example to anybody else that either was within the family or entered the family. This is what will happen to you if you dare to cross us. And I think the most interesting injury this poor girl suffered was the deep cuts to the soles of her feet, because it doesn't take much interpretation to realise what they were saying to her, which is, you are never going to run away from us. You are never going to walk away from us. You can't walk, therefore you will never leave. The Hudsons, this generation of Hudsons, the previous generation of Hudsons, hopefully there's been some intervention in the younger generation of the Hudsons, but it's the family subculture. It's a self-perpetuating loop of who's who in the social standing, and how, if that is threatened by an outsider or an agency or an education department or social services, the group will clamp up and not say anything. And this is what happened initially at the inquiries, the police inquiries, when Rachel had been found. The family group clamped together. I'm not sure when, but there was obviously something, that there was a loose link between them. And as soon as that one loose link was pulled, the whole amorphous mess fell apart. They all just started screaming, shouting, and very much laying the blame at each other. I think there's 2 interesting strands to this story. Obviously, the death, the brutality, the brutalising and the death of Rachel. is the most important part of this story. But I think the other strand that is interesting is Craig, how he had tried to get away from the group and had just been sucked back into it. And that is very reminiscent of Trudy, how she had tried to get away from the brutalisation of Ronald Sr. Apparently he would do all unspeakable things to her, and as I mentioned, that he actually did have a charge of GBH against her. So this was a brutal man who was brutalising his young wife, who therefore then went on to brutalise their children, because it's fragile. That sense of power, that sense of status is very fragile. So you have to maintain the brutality, because that's all you know, to remain in that state of power. Because if you don't have that power and control, you, instead of victimising other people, you become the victim. And as the dysfunction and the abuse that both of them had come from, they were very familiar with that. So that's why there was a pathological need to maintain their status within the family group subculture. That's why it's interesting that Craig had tried to get away. He'd been dragged back. There's an inevitability that we will get dragged back. And he himself was convicted of murder. He wasn't only dragged back, he had to again earn his spurs by having gone off with Rachel. You either brutalise her yourself and you become one of us and you can stay within the safety of the group, or you become like her. Look what we're doing to her. We could easily do that to you. And there's nobody that's taking any notice. We've had the police round looking for her. We were able to get rid of them really easily. You're one of 12. Nobody's going to report you missing. Who is there? And even if you were reported missing, we can fob the authorities off, because we're good at that. We've done that. We've spent a lifetime not having to engage with agencies and authorities. A little thing saying, where's your number 7 son? A half-hearted inquiry about where's Craig gone, that's not going to go anywhere. So he, I imagine, became one of them out of pure fear for himself. And remember, he had a child with Rachel as well, so that was probably held as collateral. Talking of Rachel's children, I cannot find what happened to them. I have looked. I don't know whether they came under the remit of social services and they were fostered or adopted, or whether Rachel's family got to look after them. I can't find any details about that. One sad little codetta to this story is that between Rachel's body being found and the trial going ahead, Rachel was in fact buried by the Hudsons, or buried under the influence of the Hudsons, and her original family were kept away from her funeral, and they don't know where her final resting place is. And that is the last piece of perverse control that the Hudson family are able, even after all these years, to exert over Rachel, that her family isn't allowed to grieve and mourn for her properly because they don't know where she is.
Thank you so much for listening and watching. And if I could again please ask you to like, subscribe, share and put comments below. Always, as I say, really interesting to hear what people have to say about certain topics, even if they're, again, this is one of these murders that just has kind of slipped below the radar. It's in the news at the time, but then it just tends to slip below the radar. And that's why I find some of the non-populous ones quite fascinating, because a murderer is a murderer and a victim is a victim, of course. Until next time, thanks ever so much. Keep safe and goodbye.